Hi, I'm Jessica. I've been an artist for about 20 years, and I've been mostly in LA, and I've done a lot of different kinds of work: small sculptures, big sculptures, installations. That's what I usually do, are sculptures. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I started doing work based on my immediate environment. I was doing work about all sorts of other stuff, and I just started looking at the ground around me and thinking, maybe I need to start just looking in my immediate environment for inspiration. And one of the first things that I looked at was a tree that was in my backyard that was dying. It was a 30, 40-year-old apricot tree. And I'm sure you guys have seen trees like this, where they've been cut and kind of amputated over and over and over again to sort of fit into a landscape or fit into the backyard. And this one, I thought was this great, beautiful shape, but it was dying. And I kind of fell in love with this tree. Like it was sort of rotting in front of me, but it was really sad to see it go. And I wanted to do a sculpture about it. It was like an effigy, like the last cast off of a dying person in a way. And what I did was I made a mold of it, which is a latex mold of the entire tree. It was 18 by 18 by about 18 foot. And it was literally latex that was painted on the tree and then pulled off carefully. It was a process that I did over about 6 months. And I got to know the tree. I got to know every little detail of the tree, and I got very interested in how it became a metaphor for our survival. Given the environmental climate we have, how are we going to survive, and what is our relationship with nature? And it pushed me, in a way, into a whole new area of way of looking at my artwork. And I started thinking of myself as a kind of naturalist, kind of new naturalist, which would be a kind of aesthetic liaison between, a connector between science and the public, between nature and the public. And another inspiration that I had was that this tree did die that year. And the last fruit from that tree, it had like 5 leaves and 1 apricot on it the last year. And I thought, I have to do something about this last fruit before this tree is completely gone. And so I just did this very simple porcelain version of that last fruit. And I showed the two works together, this large effigy of a tree that's dying and its last fruit. And it became this metaphor for how we survive and the beauty in survival, even at your last breath, the beauty that you can have as you survive. And then I returned to a book that I had read about 2 or 3 years previous called Botany of Desire, which was by a science journalist named Michael Pollan. He's kind of a crazy guy, very influential right now in the science world and in the naturalist world. And he was describing a fruit orchard up in upstate New York that was part of the Department of Agriculture and part Cornell University, where they were trying to save varieties of apples going extinct. And I thought, well, why is an apple going extinct? We have apples in the grocery store. What's going on? And what I learned was, this is what artists do. We like step into territories where we're like, this sounds really interesting, and I know absolutely nothing about it. I'm not a scientist. I really have no business being here, but I'm fascinated, and I can't help myself. So what I learned from Michael in this book was that when you look at an apple, right, you have 5 carpels, which are these little sections where the seeds are, and there's 1 to 3 seeds in an apple in each one of those carpels. So you have like 5 to 15 seeds in here. And if you plant each one of these seeds, they're just like us. So when your parents got together, and they did their thing, and they had a baby, right? The baby's not a clone of them. Each one, if you have siblings, you know that your siblings are very different from you, right? Some of them are like really different than you. You have certain traits that maybe remind you of your parents, but you are not the clone of your parents. And just like that, the apple, every seed in the apple is genetically individual. So if this is a Braeburn apple from New Zealand, and if I planted all the seeds from this apple, I would get 16 different trees. I would not get the Braeburn ever again. You'd never get it ever again. And that's a concept that kind of blew me away. Like, okay, well, I watched Sesame Street. Like, you know, they had this Macintosh apple, you know, the big fat red apple that you see in the grocery store. And they split it open and they said, oh, look, you know, see that tree over there? I took a seed from this apple and I put it in the ground. And this big tree came out. And look, I have the same apple, all these Macintosh. It's a total lie. It's an absolute lie. So I was like, what is going on? I don't understand how this could be possible. So I kept on reading Michael Pollan, and then I learned about grafting. And I learned that the way that they get another Braeburn, the way that you get the same Macintosh, the same Fuji, is that you take a little bud off of the tree that is the Macintosh tree, this little itty-bitty bud, that little sliver of a thing, your scion is what they call it, and then you put it into the rootstock of an already alive tree, and then you essentially keep the tree alive. So you have to keep the tree alive over and over and over again. And you never let it die. It never goes to seed, really. It goes to seed, but you never use the seed. You literally have to clone it and keep the tree alive to keep the variety alive. It never dies. So if you discover a Braeburn or a yellow bellflower 200 years ago in your orchard, you planted a whole bunch of seeds, and then one tree was beautiful, yellow, and sweet, and you said, my God, I've got to have that. I'm going to call it yellow bellflower, and I'm going to graft it over and over again so I can have a whole orchard of just this clone over and over again. Then you have to keep doing that for 200 years to have it be present now. So a lot of apple varieties have kind of died off, but humans along the way have chosen certain apples that they thought tasted good or made really good alcoholic cider or made really good applesauce or really good apple pie. There were all different reasons why they might have chosen, after they planted a whole bunch of seeds, why they would have said, oh, the fruit from that tree tastes good or works really well for this recipe. We're going to clone it. We're going to graft it over and over again. So what I did was I went to this place that was called the Noah's Ark of apple orchards, this plant genetics resource unit up in upstate New York. I didn't have any money, but I heard about this place, and it was where they were housing varieties of apples that were dying off, right? I told you they had to keep on planting them to keep them alive, right? So there are orchards all over the world where the orchardists are dying off themselves, where their kids don't want to take over the orchard, or there's just not enough money to keep up the orchard. And that apple, that special apple that they've developed there, is going to die off unless somebody keeps it alive. So there's a scientist named Dr. Philip Porcelain who went around the world for 30 years looking for these orchards and collecting the buds and bringing them back to his sort of Noah's Ark of orchards, where he then grafted them on and is keeping thousands of varieties of different kinds of apples from all over the world alive so that we have that genetic material to work with. So this is an image from one of his trees. So you go into the orchard, and every 2 trees is a different apple. So one tree is these itty-bitty apples that don't even look like apples. I mean, that was kind of the amazing thing about the description that got me to go to this, was just 2 paragraphs in a book in which this man, this writer, Pollan, was walking through the orchard, and he was describing apples that were the size of like a pea, and apples that were huge, and apples that were white and yellow and red, and some tasted like banana and nuts. It didn't even sound like the fruit that I knew. And so I went there and I started shooting all of these apples, and I thought, if I can make a porcelain apricot, surely why don't I just start making artwork about these crazy apples that actually show the extreme diversity that is possible in nature. We've controlled nature quite a bit through agriculture. Agriculture provides a very consistent, collaborative relationship with nature. I think I respect agriculture quite a bit. We kind of think of nature as out here and that we go visit it. But agriculture has had this tandem relationship the whole time with nature. But at the same time, in order to make food products for us, it's narrowed what we know of as the apple into things that they can produce easily, that they can have orchards that are huge and produce enough food for us. But in the meantime, there are all these incredible varieties of apples, beautiful shapes and colors. So I brought home hundreds of these apples to my studio, and I started sculpting them. And I started choosing about 10 of the apples that were the widest variety I could find to just show, like, if I put apple on this, what is it gonna, people are gonna actually know that it's quite odd. So this is yellow bellflower, and here's a porcelain sculpture of that. And here's an unnamed cluster from France, and here's a sculpture of that. This is Deacon Jones. It's about, I like to say it's the size of a baby's head. It's about this big of an apple, weighs about 3 pounds. It was it was founded in, I think, the late 1700s. And it's been kept alive over and over again. And now it only exists in this Noah's Ark of orchards. And these are the sculptures of the Deacon Jones. And this is Kazakhstan elite. So in addition to all of these kinds of apples that are that have been culled by humans and planted, there's also wild apple groves in which, remember I was telling you about those seeds. If you planted all the seeds and they wouldn't be sweet actually. When you plant out the seeds of one tree, say 1,000 seeds in a row, you don't necessarily get another apple that's sweet. You get apples that are different shapes and different colors and possibly really tart. I'm sure you guys have bitten into an apple that's pretty tart. Some of them are what we call spitters, like you can't even take a bite of them. And what's really odd is that in the middle of Kazakhstan, which is in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, are wild apple groves. They're the only ones left on the planet. And there, they have been undisturbed. So alongside of a little sapling are 300-year-old apple trees. And they've been mixing and breeding, and natural selection has happened there. And so this root stock and these apple trees are the strongest trees on the planet. They're the ones that their genetic material can be added to all of these sort of weakened varieties that humans have been interrupting throughout the centuries, and their genetic material can strengthen it so that we can save apple trees, essentially. We can save this genetic material. And they grow wild and sweet. They're the only ones on the planet where if you plant out all the seeds from these wild apple trees in Kazakhstan, every tree will pop up and it will be a sweet apple. It's incredible. So I did some sculptures about that. I also went back to the Plant Genetics Resource Unit, and I met sort of like on this one side, there's this Noah's Ark where I met Dr. Philip Forslund, where he's saving all of these varieties like a kind of, like a historian, a curator, somebody who's deciding what we're going to have in the future in terms of apples. And then on the other side, I love that it's a male-female thing too, that on the other side there's this woman who's a mother who calls herself a breeder, and she actually is a breeder. She's one of 3 apple breeders in the country, and she's the one who's actually making new varieties of apples. And she has several thousand acres in which she's crossing the old-fashioned way. She's taking the pollen from a flower of one tree, and she's putting it on the flower of another tree in an isolated way. And then you get the fruit, right, after the flowers bear the fruit. And she takes all the fruit off, cuts them out, takes all the seeds out, and then plants a row of 1,000 trees. And then she sees in that cross what all of those trees look like and what kind of apples they produce. And then out of the 1,000, she'll choose one tree and one apple that then she'll give it a name and call it a new variety of apples. And it might take her doing this several times. Remember, you don't get the fruit off of the new tree for 7 years. So these are a long time. It takes like 14 years to discover, quote unquote, a new variety of apple. And she was trying to communicate the diversity that she was seeing in all of these trees. But it was hard to see. When I went there, it was just 1,000 bushy trees. And you were like, well, I see there's some difference. She said, no, you have to come back in the winter. And she showed me a couple pictures from her notebook in which she had dropped sheets behind these trees in the middle of winter to try to show the architecture of the trees. And I thought they were beautiful photographs. They were just these little things, these amateur things that she had in a notebook. And she said, look at all the beauty of all the difference of these trees. And I thought, I need to come back and I need to show her work the way it needs to be shown. I need to bring in a professional photographer, a 20 by 30 foot muslin backdrop in the middle of winter and capture what she's doing with these trees. So that's what I did. We brought in these scaffolding, and I brought in backdrops. I hired 4 grips from the Rochester Institute of Technology, and I brought in a photographer that I know from LA, and we started documenting her work in the middle of winter, which was quite cold, in order to get the silhouette of these trees. So these are all sisters from the same cross, right? I was talking about that cross. And they're all, they were bred to be columnar, which means a column, right? But you'll notice that even within those trees, that look at all those different types of columns. And this was just the 1,000, this is part of a row of the 1,000 trees. And these are only a few years old, so to see what their full potential is, it'll take another 4 or 5 years. She's a patient scientist. We called these the Smiling Sisters. This was another row of, And then we also documented the clones, because she is working with the clones, with grafted clones. And this is a tree that was bred partly for its weeping habit, right, this draping habit, but also because it resists a certain kind of pest called apple scab. So these trees have multiple functions. And I was trying to capture their beauty and make them a portrait of them so that you could see them as I said, when your parents get together and they produced you, there's this beautiful person that happens that's only once in a lifetime, once in a world time, once a forever. And like that, these trees have this individual quality. This one was bred for another disease and also because it has this central leader. It's also part of a series of trees that are bred because on their branches, when their branches are weak, they develop the most fruit. So I'm going to leave you with a picture from a particular part of the orchard in which these trees with the central leader are in row after row. And I found this field to be kind of sadly beautiful. The trees are amputated, much like the apricot tree that I was showing you, the way someone had cut off all the limbs in my yard, on my tree in my yard. They do this here because the weak branches bear the most fruit, and because humans need so much fruit, they need so much food. We are engineering and pruning these trees in order to get the most that we can out of them. And we have this reciprocal relationship with them that is quite beautiful and is about our survival and their survival too. And so my work tries to capture that relationship, and both the beauty of it and the sort of harshness of it too. And so this was this field that I thought was sort of hauntingly beautiful. Thank you.